Hello listeners, I am your speaker Casey, and as many of you may know, I am currently undertaking the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University. I hope that this course will make me more informed and better equipped for future projects and interviews on the podcast. In the meantime, I will be releasing renewed versions of older episodes with updates from previous guests. If you want to find out what I remember from the time of each interview and get in-depth updates from the guests, I've been writing blog posts as I go through older episodes and adding them to my website, cultvaultpodcast.com, which you can also find links to in the episode description. You can find links on my website for support on navigating recovery from cultic abuse, to learn more about how to help a loved one, or become more informed about the subject of cults and coercive control. My emails are still open, and I am carefully curating a list of guests to speak with once I am back to interviewing officially next year. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch. And now, on to today's updated episode.
So hi Jen, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You reached out to me recently, and from the work you do online, you also managed to connect me to several other awesome people who, one of which I've already spoken to, and he was delightful, and another person I'm speaking to next week. So thank you so much and welcome. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, so much for having me. I'm Jen Kiaba. I was born and raised in the Unification Church. I left in my early 20s, and today I'm an artist and an educator, and my art very much focuses on the experience of growing up as a young woman in the Unification Church and the various circumstances that brought me to leave, which I'm sure that we will touch on through the course of our conversation today.
Yes, I hope so. I'm looking to get into the thick of things. So you mentioned that you were born and raised into the church. Your parents, are they first generation? And did they meet through the church, or were they already together when they kind of found the Unification Church?
No, they met in the church. They were matched by Reverend Moon. So Reverend arranged all of the marriages. I think that there were some circumstances where some people did join the church together and they were allowed to remain married. But from what I understand, a lot of people who joined the church with their partner, the marriage was broken up within the church. Because in the Unification Church theology, it was really through Reverend Moon you were supposed to receive the blessing, is what we called it, which was the marriage ceremony. And from an ideological perspective, this is sort of what connected you to like God's lineage. So I'm sure, you mentioned that you spoke to somebody else. I think it was Teddy. And so I don't know how much, I don't know how much you and Teddy got into the theology of the church. So I don't want to go over any ground that's already been covered so that, we can cover some fresh things. And so if, lineage and the blessing ceremony is all stuff that you guys have already covered in a previous episode, we can skip around that. But yeah, I think from what I've read, and I've spent a lot of time reading first generation memoirs and even, testimonies from people that are still in the church, it seems as though a majority of people who join the church with either a boyfriend or girlfriend or a marriage partner, that relationship was broken up.
That's so unfortunate, because it sounds like if they need to be married by Reverend Moon, is there no opportunity there for just a second ceremony or a second marriage, kind of where they're remarried by somebody new? I know it obviously under the guise of cult-like methods of control, it is more beneficial for them to be separated and matched with new people.
Correct. Yeah.
But if the Unification Church are taking the kind of stance that they are not anyway cult-like, then it's unfortunate in that sense that there was no opportunity for those people to just be remarried under Moon.
I think that there were circumstances where there were people who did get to be remarried through Moon. And so I certainly don't want to speak for everybody, because I do know of some circumstances where there was a couple that had children, they joined the church, they were blessed by Moon within that same union, and then they had second generation children after the blessing. And so there became this caste system between the children who were born before and then children who were born after. So children who were born before the parents joined the church would have been called Jacob's children or a Jacob's child. And then if you were born into the church, you were a blessed child. And so it was, those were very strange circumstances, I think, within those families. But again, I don't have any statistics on it, but I do think that that was probably pretty rare.
I wonder if it had anything to do with social status or financial contribution or ability to financially contribute to the church that kind of maybe swayed those decisions. But that's just me speculating. So me and Teddy, we did cover quite a bit of sort of Sun Myung Moon himself and where he came from and how he grew up and how the church was founded. Mm-hmm. But would you like to briefly summarize the beliefs and practices that make the Unification Church what it is?
Sure. I mean, I can share from my experience. I think that every family had a slightly different culture. You know, there wasn't a homogenous culture in the Unification Church. The more I share stories with other second generation, the more we're like, wait, you were taught X, Y, and Z. Well, I was taught A, B, C. And so that's always very funny. So from my perspective, what I was taught was that Reverend Moon had met Jesus while he was praying on a mountaintop on when he was 16 on Easter morning. Jesus came to him and told him that Jesus' mission was not indeed to die on the cross, but to have a family where he could then have, you know, the blood lineage of God carried out. And so it was the belief of Reverend Moon, you know, vis-a-vis this supposed vision that Jesus had actually failed in his original mission. And supposedly Moon said no to Jesus twice. And then the third time that Jesus asked, Reverend Moon reluctantly took up the mantle of the second coming to become the Messiah. And I was brought up to believe that despite the fact that I was born physically to my parents, they were not my real parents. Reverend and Mrs. Moon were true parents, and that's what we called them. Or we would use the Korean word abuji for father and omani for mother. And so I think that was sort of a psychological way in which the group kind of broke the nuclear bonds of our family a little bit. And my family, we grew up outside of a Unification Church hub. So there was pretty densely populated areas like in New York City, Washington, D.C., and like the San Francisco Bay Area. And because my father was getting his advanced degrees, we were a little bit nomadic, partially because we had 5 children, and it's very hard to get people to rent to 5 kids once they see like how much damage we did to rental properties. But also, you know, as he went from degree to degree, he was changing schools, and so we would move. And so I grew up outside of one of those more insular communities, and I didn't really get to see other church members very often, except for maybe on holy days. So what my parents did is they created a very insular environment within our family. So we had morning service every day at 6 o'clock. We would get up, we would sing holy songs in front of the altar, which was usually like a coffee table or a side table, and we'd have, you know, Reverend Moon's picture on this table. And morning service, you know, we would usually have a prayer room. If we had a big enough house where there was an unoccupied room, it was an empty room with, you know, a coffee table with like a white towel on it or something as our altar. And you would go to the, you know, the entrance of the room, do a half bow to the true parent's picture, and then you would go and do a full bow in front of the altar. And then we would sing holy songs to prepare the spiritual atmosphere, because it was important to have a high spiritual atmosphere. And then you would open with a prayer, and then you would spend like the next hour to hour and a half reading Reverend Moon's words. And eventually this ritual became called hunduke, but when I was growing up, it was just morning service. And, you know, I learned later that a lot of other families didn't do morning service every day. They would do something called pledge, which was the Sunday ritual, where you would wake up at 5 a.m. and basically kind of do the same thing. We just, you know, we were really into it, I guess, to the point where if my father was away at a conference and my mother was making breakfast, at 8 years old, I was running morning service with my siblings. So we were hardcore. And in the church, second generation were called blessed children, as I mentioned before. And if, you were unfortunate enough to be brought into the church as a child, you were sort of a lower caste as a Jacob's child. But I didn't really learn about that until I was older. But growing up, I knew that sex was the thing that had destroyed all of human history, right? So in the church, they believed that Lucifer as an angel was jealous of Adam and Eve. And, the theology sort of states that like Lucifer didn't get any less love from God after Adam and Eve were created, but Adam and Eve got more love. And so Lucifer was jealous, and he left his proper position by seducing Eve, who was like 16 at the time, poor underage girl, before she had reached the stage of perfection. And by having a spiritual sexual relationship with her, and I don't know how one does that, they committed the fall. And so that was sort of biblically the eating of the apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And supposedly through this sexual relationship with Lucifer, who was supposed to be sort of her mentor, Eve comes to understand that she was actually supposed to be the wife of Adam. And so then she went and seduced Adam, trying to sort of regain her old position and restore what she had lost. But then that contributed to the fall between Adam and Eve. And so, there's very much that sort of misogynistic culture in the church that it was all the woman's fault. There was never really the blaming of the, however many thousands of year old angel who seduced the underage woman. But from that perspective, the church believed that all of human history's lineage, blood lineage, is something that was very important in the church. It was connected to Satan. So Lucifer became Satan after the fall. And so it was only through going through these blessing ceremonies that were officiated by Reverend Moon that people could be engrafted onto God's lineage. And a lot of the divine principle, which is the theological text in the Unification Church, talks about the lineages that God was trying to prepare. And it's sort of this text that explores almost the chess game between God and Satan, where they're both trying to like make these moves to gain control of human history and essentially like human lineage. And so it was through Moon's marrying of the much younger Hak Jahan that he was able to establish the first, quote, true family and have true children. Now, something that I learned about many years later is that allegedly, and I'm sure you and Teddy have discussed this, in I think the 1950s, in the earlier days of the church, in order to engraft onto this lineage, Moon was actually practicing something called pigurun, which was womb cleansing. So he would have sex with his female followers. And it's actually not that uncommon in certain religions to have sexual rites. But in Korea, it was not approved of. And so Moon was imprisoned for this act. And I think that when he tried to import the Unification Church theology to the United States, was when he realized that probably wouldn't go over so well with Americans. And so this sexual rite where he would supposedly even have orgies with his female followers became the 3-day ceremony. And so the 3-day ceremony was something that first generation had to go through after their blessing. And it was a sexual rite, again, modeled off of the old group sex, where in front of an altar with Moon's picture and like 2 cushions for Moon and his wife to spiritually attend, for 3 nights, the new husband and wife had to have sex. The woman would be on top the first night, representing the mother giving birth to Adam, and then like Eve the second night, and then the third night, it's the man as the restored Adam is on top subjugating Eve. And so that's how these, I'm rolling my eyes inside too. That's how, you restored the fall. And additionally, allegedly, at the blessing ceremony, everybody was supposed to drink holy wine. And so the alleged part is that supposedly there was either blood and or Moon's sperm in the holy wine.
Yeah, that's definitely something that Teddy mentioned. When you say the blessing, is this you referring to the infamous kind of mass weddings that people will immediately refer back to the Unification Church?
Yes. So the blessing ceremony is the mass wedding ceremony. And I don't know why in the doctrine it was a mass wedding, but it was always, as far as I understand, like the first blessing ceremony was 36 couples. So it's always been more than one.
And your parents were part of one of those blessing ceremonies?
Yes. So my parents, they were matched, I believe, in 1979 in the New Yorker Hotel ballroom, which I believe the Unification Church still owns the New Yorker Hotel, which is right across the street from Madison Square Garden. And then in 1982, they were blessed in Madison Square Garden in the mass wedding ceremony that at least most Americans associate with the Unification Church.
Okay, so they were matched in the ballroom on that day. Did they go there expecting to be paired? I mean, is there sort of like this is the day you will be paired with somebody?
I think so. So I don't think that Moon did these matching ceremonies very regularly. I think that there were certain criteria that had to be met as well. And I think that my mother was considered to be too young in the church to have been matched. So she joined, I think in 74, 75. You were supposed to have been in the church for like 3+ years and have what were called spiritual children. So basically people that you had indoctrinated into the church.
Right.
You're supposed to have, I think, 3 of those. So whether or not my mom met the criteria, I'm unclear on. But again, from reading other first-gen memoirs, I do know that in certain cases, and I think with this 1979 matching, they were short on sisters. They didn't have enough women attending. So in some cases, people were already prepared. They knew that this was happening, and their central figure, who was basically like their boss in the church, would be like, you're going, you're not going. It would be dictated to them. So there were definitely some people that knew it was happening, but didn't think that they were going. And then suddenly they'd be told on very short notice, nope, we need more sisters. You're going. So again, I don't know if that's part of my mother's story. You know, both of my parents were always very reticent about a lot of their past. And I know that my parents didn't really want to be matched to each other. So it wasn't exactly like this, and this is the beautiful story of how we met kind of a thing. I think that was one of those things that neither of them really wanted to talk about very much.
Yeah, that was definitely going to be a question I was going to ask about whether they actually found, not just a match under Moon, but a match within themselves as well, whether they felt they had that connection. But it sounds as if, unfortunately, that's not the case.
No, I mean, I think that both of my parents were disappointed to be matched to another Westerner, and specifically another American. So there's a lot of racism in the Unification Church. And I think that, if you were to ask different people what like the racial hierarchy in the church would be, you'd get different answers based on people's personal experience. But Koreans were definitely at the top. My perspective as a child was that like all Asians were better than Westerners, but Moon treated the Japanese very, very poorly. So I think if you grew up Japanese, or if you were a Japanese first generation member, you would probably have a very different perspective. But Moon spoke very poorly of Americans, especially American women. And so I think that both of my parents felt as though it was like a punishment to be married to another American. I'm sure that my father would have loved to have a Japanese wife. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of the Western men in the church preferred Japanese women because they perceived them as being very like quiet and submissive, whereas American women had much stronger personalities by comparison. And so it was a very patriarchal, very misogynistic culture. And so Japanese women, I think, were prized as marriage partners. And then from my mother's perspective, I think that she wanted to be matched to a Korean because they were considered the chosen people. So to not have gotten a chosen person was probably seen as like a personal failing.
Mm-hmm. But they went on to have 5 children together. So in the eyes of what they were supposed to accomplish for the church in terms of creating, pure children who were free of sin, they accomplished that. Yeah. So you're one of 5. Are you at sort of the older end or the younger end?
I'm the eldest of the 5.
Okay. So when you are moving through your time in the church, I suppose, you mentioned that you would be setting up the services in the morning if your parents were busy. So so you were kind of setting the example of being devout follower of Unification Church as the eldest of the 5. Wow, that's a lot of responsibility for a young person, isn't it?
Well, especially because I remember when I was very young, and again, this may be one of those things that like it differed from family to family, but I remember when I was very young, my mom telling me, when we were matched and blessed, many blessed couples thought that their blessed children would be perfect. We were told you would be perfect, and some of us thought that meant our babies wouldn't even cry. And so in the church theology, there is very much this expectation of growing to perfection. There is even considered three stages of growth. There's the formation stage, which is like when you're a baby to 7. There's the growth stage, which is like your adolescence. And then there's the perfection stage or the completion stage. And technically by 21, you were supposed to be perfect. So, not only is there the pressure of being the oldest and setting the example, but also, by the way, we expect you to be perfect, whatever that is.
So it's funny that you left in your early 20s. Did you kind of reach 21 and go, well, I'm still not perfect, so I'm done with this because no promise has been fulfilled?
No, I left because at 20 years old, I had been coerced into an arranged marriage and blessing, and we can get into that later if you want. But for me, it was the breaking point in many, many years of questioning. And I think that it was sort of this time when whatever like inner fortitude and inner voice that I had been trying to suppress for many years as I questioned, like it came online screaming. And it was like, get out now. And so I couldn't get out of that particular event and found myself married to a stranger from another country. But in the length of a little less than 2 years, I was able to get a church divorce, and that was sort of it. Because to break the blessing, we had 2 basically cardinal sins in the church. One was to fall, which was sex before or outside marriage, the blessing ceremony. And then the other one was to break the blessing. So I didn't fall, but I did break the blessing. And so I was basically ousted at that point.
Right.
I mean, even when people knew I was struggling, they put up walls. There was definitely, there's no like specific shunning process. Like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, there is a very specific process to shun and disfellowship somebody. Within the Unification Church, there wasn't something like that. It was just a more unofficial, you were like stonewalled by everybody.
I suppose in that sense, it would be more relieving to actually just have a process there where you're like, okay, I know this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I know that that's what's expected of you as you continue to be devout members of the church. But the fact that there isn't that and it still happened is almost worse than those kind of policies, I say in inverted commas, be it being carried out. But you mentioned there that one of the cardinal sins was it was the fall. So it's okay for Moon to commit those acts outside of marriage, but not for anybody else.
Right. Well, so in the church, the whole like sex rituals that were happening early on, that's something that most people won't admit to, or it's been sort of like, it's been hushed up at best. And then, in terms of the extramarital affairs that Moon has had, and then children outside of wedlock, the way that that's explained away is that, well, Father had providential reasons for everything that he did. So when everybody discovered that Moon had had a child out of wedlock and had foisted this child onto his right-hand man, Bohipak, to raise his child as Bohipak's own, people said, again, this was a providential affair. And people compared it to the story of Tamar in the Bible, where, yeah, I know you're shaking your head. You're like, no, that's not what it is. And anybody who's done any kind of biblical studies can point to why that story does not line up. But it was like, well, look, she tried to sleep with all of these people in order to carry on the line that would eventually lead to Jesus. That was the reasoning, not that, she actually had to have sex with somebody in order to maintain safety as a married woman. Otherwise, there would be consequences. But yeah, it was completely twisted into an excuse for why Moon could do these things that we couldn't explain. And it was basically don't question. You don't understand.
I don't know about that. That's very questionable in my eyes. But I suppose that when you are so committed to a cause, you've given years of your life, you've given yourself to a partner that you've been placed into an arranged marriage with. You've got children with that person. You've got responsibilities. For that type of scandal to come out, I mean, it would take so much at that point for somebody to say, well, no, I don't. I think you're just having affairs and coming up with scripture to basically justify your actions, which are the height of hypocrisy.
Right. I think, too, it's not just about the sunk cost. I think it's that people were groomed for so many years to excuse behaviors. I mean, the fact that Moon lived in luxury while most members struggled to even hit the poverty line, that's something that any member will explain away to you. And I think that there are so many examples of that just over the years, everybody was indoctrinated to a point to accept almost anything, that by the time this affair became public and Nansa Kong released her book, In the Shadows of the Moon, which for many people was very explosive in terms of revealing how sordid the Moon's lives were, enough people were able to just say oh, she's bitter, she's being influenced by Satan. That it was not a far stretch for them to go there. And so this whole, it was a providential affair isn't really a bridge too far.
And if you grew up sort of away from those heightened insular groups that you mentioned, what type of, well, you mentioned that you were kind of nomadic as well in the sense of moving around a lot. So what did your education look like when you were growing up?
It was terrible. I went to the same school 2 years in a row, first and second grade, and then every year I was in a different school, sometimes multiple schools a year. I think in the end, I went to 11 schools in 12 years. I graduated as a junior because I was I have to get out. I can't survive another year at a new school. And I tried homeschooling multiple times because it was so hard to adjust. So not only, is it really horrible to be the new kid every year and develop new friendships and everything like that, but as a second generation growing up outside of the protection of a church community, I was taught that I had a secret identity as a blessed child. I couldn't tell anybody who I was, otherwise Satan would attack me. And I think the fear was really, from my parents' perspective, that we would be persecuted if people knew that we were Moonies. Because my parents came of age in the church when kids were getting kidnapped and deprogrammed in the 70s and 80s before that became illegal. And so I think there was a big fear for them that we would be persecuted and potentially we would be taken away from our parents.
Right.
Unfortunately, my family was also quite abusive too. And so I think that it was a very well-founded fear that if somebody found out what our home life was like, CPS probably would have come in So that's Child Protective Services in the United States. They probably would have come in and put us into foster care. But anyway, so I had a very hard time adjusting to all of this change. And so there were multiple times where I dropped out of school to homeschool. But my parents never got me a homeschool curriculum. So for a semester in 7th grade, a semester in 8th grade, and a semester in 10th grade, I was supposedly homeschooling. But basically they were like, here's some encyclopedias that you can read. And that was my education.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that brings a whole new level of difficulty to your personal experience, because not only are you in a constant state of upheaval and like being unsettled, it sounds like the only constant in your life at that point then is, your morning services and your routine around everything to do with the church. So where most young people are having experiences with people outside of the church and culture and views and other types of religions, with people in public school who, talk about Christianity or Catholicism or Buddhism or whatever, sort of background they're coming, or even atheism, you're obviously, you're more focused on like, okay, new school, new teachers, new curriculum. Oh, I've just covered this in my last school, or, oh, I was going to cover this in my school, but I never got a chance to do it. So now everyone's really far ahead of me and I'm in this class. And so that's just another added layer of stress, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've known Teddy for many years, and I've heard him share his story where he grew up in the Irvington area, which was sort of the hotbed of persecution for members in the Unification Church, because the Moons had their East Garden mansion there, and then a few miles away they had their Belvedere mansion and sort of training center. So from my understanding, a lot of Teddy's bandwidth was taken up in protecting his identity and not letting people know. So I think it's really interesting to hear that perspective, because I can completely relate to that, but then also layering in that upheaval too of like, okay, no one can know who I am. And I have like no like regular bonds with people. It's something that gave me a new perspective on my own upbringing, because, I normalized everything as a child. I was like, oh, well, this is how it is because this is how my family is. And so,
yeah. I mean, what else are you supposed to do as a child?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Also, something that's kind of interesting that you mentioned is the fact that you kind of created your own self-sealing system,
yes,
as a family. So I've spoken to a few people now. I spoke to one lady who spoke about having really, really devout Catholic parents, and the parents would take that Catholicism and they would use it to justify abusing the children. And they would say, any type of, like another person I've just spoken to as well, he would listen to a Pink Floyd album or a Nirvana album and be persecuted not by the church but by his mum, who took those ideals so literally and applied them within the family home that it wasn't necessarily the church or the sect or the congregation that was imposing these cult-like methods of control, but it was actually the primary caregivers within the home that were taking those methods and applying them within the house. So it sounds almost like we've got one of those types of situations where you're not directly affected by the church itself because you're living away from the big hubs of activity where you attend their services, but your parents are taking parts of the religion and almost applying it to the house where you're experiencing those types of methods, but just under your roof.
Right. It wasn't until I was 12 and we moved to Arizona that I experienced living in a church community and started to understand what the larger culture of the group was like. But one of the things that I've come to understand in researching high demand groups is that there's a cultic spectrum, and that can go from one-on-one relationships, domestic violence is very much that model, to the familial unit all the way up to a larger religious group. And so I think that my family was definitely that self-sealed system within the familial unit, but also underneath the Unification Church. And additionally, I look at my parents' behavior as an adult, and I definitely see that there was both of my parents existed on the narcissistic spectrum. My mother maybe more as a self-righteous narcissist versus my father. And, whether those were inherent mental and psychological conditions that they had prior to the church, or whether it was inherited from the culture of the church and the culture of Moon, who was most definitely a narcissist. I don't know, but it was definitely something that I could see in terms of how the family culture was implemented.
I think that's the big difference there, and you've just summed up what I was trying to say. You've summed it up perfectly. I always find myself struggling to actually voice what I'm thinking in an articulate way, but you've just come out and said it so wonderfully. But the big difference is that Catholicism and Christianity aren't necessarily cults or cult-like. Branches and sects and congregations within the umbrella are definitely, but the Unification Church is absolutely 100% one of those kind of high controlling, and using those methods of control and using thought reform and indoctrination on its members. And then obviously you're underneath that with your own self-sealing system as well. So when people talk about having these cult-like family environments underneath sort of the guise of Catholicism or whichever religious movement the parents or primary caregivers may be using as their kind of influence, there's the opportunity there to kind of look at Christianity as a whole and say, well, actually, what you're saying and what you're doing is not the same as kind of what Christianity stands for as a whole. Whereas the Unification Church is very different in that sense, because you're then almost like in another hierarchy of another hierarchy of all those really difficult manipulation tactics and kind of almost brainwashing. So, that's definitely a different perspective that I haven't come across speaking to other Unification Church members and ex-members. But what was it like for your siblings growing up at this point? Do you speak to them about it, or are you kind of all just feeling the same level of being unsettled?
All of my siblings, as far as I know, are out, but the level to which we talk about our experiences can be very different. My sister is the next closest in age to me, and she and I have spoken pretty extensively about our experiences. And she and I used to keep up a blog together that we would kind of write back and forth to each other, just, sharing memories and things that happened. My brothers, I don't think that they had the same level of indoctrination. They didn't go to as many like workshops and camps as my sister and I did. And, when I say workshops and camps, like I'm really talking about indoctrination activities where, we'd be sent away for a week and we'd be stuck in lectures almost all day with very little breaks. I don't think that they had that level of influence. I don't know why. I don't know if it was money or just like the family was so unsettled by that point. And I think that, even between my sister and myself, I was definitely sent on more of those kinds of activities. And so my sister had a different experience. I think that from family to family and sibling to sibling, everybody has a unique history with the Unification Church, just based on how their parents implemented the teaching in raising each child.
I think that's definitely something I was going to ask about, whether your siblings are still kind of within the movement or practicing members of the Unification Church. But so you've had this time of moving around everywhere and trying to get through school. And then you mentioned in your writing to me that when you turned 14, you accessed some leadership training. So I guess on your timeline in terms of growing up within the church, that's the next significant thing to speak about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I had been sent away to camps as young as 8. So this was sort of nothing new for me. But by the time I was 14, I was in high school. And I think I was already questioning because we transplanted across the country, when I was 12. Not only was there culture shock for me moving from the East Coast to Arizona, but it was also culture shock to now be in not a large church community, but, something certainly larger than what I was used to, where the closest members were 2 hours away from us when we lived in Virginia. And so by the time I was 14, I was like, I think these people are weird. Like I remember telling my mom often, I think first gen are weird. And I'd be like, why are they so weird? I don't think that I had the language to say, I feel like these people are untrustworthy, but I'd had experiences with them as young as 8 where like they were threatening to hit me. And I was like, I don't know you, you're a stranger, you're not allowed to touch me. I wasn't taught bodily autonomy by any means, but I was just like, who is this person and how dare you? And so that started me kind of down this path of examining their behaviors, and also comparing it to the few experiences that I had with, quote, normal adults like my teachers. The contrast was staggering. And so by the time I was 14, I was in high school and I had developed a very close group of friends in high school, and I had a boyfriend. And so this was all very secret, hush, hush. But I think that my mom knew enough to know that I was in danger because I was starting to get rebellious. I was starting to curse her out. She'd be like, you're so low-spirited was the language that she would use. And so she sent me away to California the summer after my freshman year to this leadership training. And it was essentially like assistant counselor training for a workshop that would take place a little bit later. But it was very much like a boot camp. So they called it Hell Training. And Hell Training was basically like this thing that had been established by one of Moon's sons-in-law as he took up the leadership of the CARP branch of the church, which is the Collegiate Association for Research of Principles. And it is the front group that they recruit on college campuses in the United States. I don't know if they do in the UK. And so this person decided to create these training programs for second generation to try to mimic the experience that our parents had in conversion. Now, if you study the way that the Unification Church converted people, there is a lot of resonance between that and the way that prisoners of war in the Korean War were treated. So, again, I don't know if you and Teddy went through any of this, but basically they were implementing, what you might call torture for young children. And so that meant, doing long runs out in the heat. It meant being woken up in the middle of the night to do what were called unison jumping jacks. So I remember one night, it was 3 a.m-ish, and one of the leaders woke us up with a whistle, like a lifeguard whistle, just blowing it. And we were all sleeping on the floor in our sleeping bags, and it, scares you awake in a panic. And we were marched outside to this blacktop in the backyard and told to do jumping jacks. Now, I don't know if you and Teddy talked about unison jumping jacks, but you had to be in complete unison as somebody counted. And not only did you have to be in unison up to the number, but sometimes they'd be like, all right, now skip number 57. And if somebody did a jumping jack or shouted at 57, you started over again. So it was this very repetitive thing that you could do for hours, sometimes while chanting. Mm-hmm. And the chant that we did was absolute faith, absolute love, absolute obedience. So you have like 20 teenagers in their pajamas, barefoot, out in the middle of the night, doing jumping jacks and chanting that over and over again. And I grew up believing that I wasn't brainwashed. So then after about a week of this, we were taken to the workshop where we would be assistant counselors, and they continued to use the whistle. Anytime we heard a specific whistle pattern, we had to drop anything that we were doing and do push-ups to demonstrate the beauty of absolute obedience to the campers. So yeah, it was pretty intense. And I think that compared to what older teenagers went through at like Camp Sunrise when they were doing held training, I think that this was just like a taste of it. I think it was very minimal.
It sounds almost like you've got the kind of Unification Church and the services that you do visit when you get the chance. Then you've got this system in place at home, and then you've attended this leadership training, which is like almost like indoctrination, like all on its own. Like
right.
somebody could, like, even if this wasn't Unification Church affiliated, it sounds like boot camp for indoctrination for anything. Mm-hmm. You could send somebody there and tell them that, they're going to sell Avon for the rest of their lives, and then put them through this 4-week boot camp. And then at the end of it, they would say, well, I'm going to sell Avon for the rest of my life. It sounds like extreme thought reform in a very short period of time. And Teddy did mention it briefly, and also mentioned some of the experiences that he had with labor trafficking. And I know you mentioned that you've had experiences with that as well, but I think it was at a much younger age than what Teddy had spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, so to your point about the indoctrination, again, I think a lot of the techniques that were used on us as children were used on our parents. So, for example, anybody who was witnessed to in Berkeley probably went through Boonville, which was the camp that was outside of the Berkeley area. And I don't think that they went through something like Unity jumping jacks, but a lot of those same indoctrination techniques were used to break them. And for anybody that's interested, the book Moonwebs by Josh Freed is a fantastic exploration of that. And if anybody's interested in a different model, a UK writer named Maggie Brooks wrote a fictionalized account of her infiltrating Unification Church. It's called Heavenly Deception. And I think both of them are fantastic in terms of understanding what happens in the indoctrination process. My earliest experience with techniques like that was when I was 8. The first time that I think I was ever labor trafficked was when I was 12. And so I had moved to Arizona. And I think that, so within the church, there's various like leadership roles. I think in a more populous city, you might have had a city leader, but in Arizona, it was still a sparsely populated area. And so we had a state leader. And the state leader was also a state representative in the Arizona government. And so the first time, I think like the first week that we moved to Arizona, he had me and my sister, we were 12 and 10 respectively, and his 2 children canvassing his district for his reelection. So he would drop us off in a neighborhood with pamphlets and signs, and my sister and I as a pair and his children as a pair, we'd go knocking door to door trying to basically do election work. Now, it may not fall technically under labor trafficking in that we were not asking for money and there wasn't any money being funneled through, but I think that it would be considered inappropriate use of child labor to win an election for sure. Mm-hmm. And again, there was no adult supervising us. So we were being put into some dangerous areas, and this was summer in Arizona. So it gets to be 110 or more Fahrenheit. I don't know what that translates to into centigrade, I'm sorry, but really, really hot. So when you take these 2 East Coast kids from a very kind of balmy Virginia experience and put them out in the desert, I got heat stroke that first day. So I was nauseous, I had a headache, I was very dehydrated. And instead of somebody being like, oh, are you okay? Do you need water or medical care? I was told to stop caning out, which means like stop being negative, And that was a technique that was used a lot to keep each other in line, you know. So it was the phrase refers to Cain who killed Abel. Right. So basically you're being told like you are being evil and you might kill somebody with this kind of attitude.
Right.
And so, you know, I look at that as sort of my earliest experience. But the next week was July 4th, and the state leader and my mother set us roaming through a city park to sell light ropes to people that were sitting waiting to watch the fireworks. I don't know what happened with the money. We were told that, you know, we were raising money to like do fun activities, like go to water parks and things. And, you know, like on one hand, you might say like, oh, well, that's kind of like kids having a lemonade stand or something. But it wasn't initiated by us. We were told, here is your product. You are going to go out and fundraise and make money. And so, you know, those were sort of the more minimal experiences. But then certainly when I was 17, I was part of STF, which was short for Special Task Force. And that was like the year-long mission where we were transported across the country in vans to raise money for the church.
And Teddy spoke about the pressures of being part of an STF group. And, you know, like if you didn't make enough money, you'd sleep in the van that night instead of staying in the hotel.
I only stayed in a hotel 2 times. Like that was completely not the norm by the time that I was on STF, which I think was 2002. So Teddy's a little older than me. We lived in the vans. We were sleeping in parking lots most of the time. That was our norm.
It
was not a punishment. I mean, you were shamed if you didn't make enough money. Like I had to report my goal every morning. If it wasn't a high enough goal, people would be like, no, you need to break through to crush out. So crush out means like make a lot of money. You were supposed to break through with Spirit World, you know. If I didn't meet my goal, there was also shame. So I had to report at the end of the night as I like folded up my money and handed it up how much money I had made and reiterate what my goal was. So if I didn't make it, everybody knew. And then the team captain reported all of those numbers per person up to headquarters. So it was never like, oh, you didn't make enough money this week, you're not sleeping in a hotel. It was like a treat if we got to stay. And the one time I remember that we stayed in a hotel is like a strong word, when it wasn't like a regional workshop, we stayed at a motel that was so dirty and so gross that I slept on my sleeping bag on top of the bed because I was so skeeved out. And like, I'm the kind of kid that like when my mom took us hiking one time, instead of taking us to a campground, she pulled over on the side of the road, had us crawl under barbed wire, and we slept out in the desert. And I was cool with that. So this motel was nasty.
You'd like rather be in the van at that point.
I would have rather been in the van or in the dirt than in this motel. And I think that there was like drug deals going down and prostitution at this motel. So it was, you know, it was not a lot of money that we were spending.
Yeah, I mean,
this could stay.
What's the incentive to join that program for a year? Obviously, it's to kind of raise money for the church and
well, it was compulsory too. I mean, it wasn't said that it was
going to say, how do you get people to do that if they kind of catch wind that they're going to be sleeping in a van for a year?
So there are 2 points that I want to make to that. One was that one of Reverend Moon's sons had taken leadership of the second generation at that point, and he established something called the 7-year course. And so that was 2 years of STF. So the first year was fundraising, and then the second year was supposed to be witnessing. And then you were supposed to go to the University of Bridgeport, which the Unification Church had like a 60% stake or something in, like they had financed a lot of it. So while Moon's children got to go to Harvard, we were supposed to go to like one of the worst universities in the United States. And then you were supposed to do like a year of mission work, which would have been like in another country. And so it was called the 7-year course. It was also called like the formula course. And basically, like if you wanted to be considered a second generation in good standing, you had to do and complete the 7-year course, which I did not. And there was a lot of shame associated with either not attending or failing to make it. Like if you got too sick or injured to continue fundraising. And so there was that piece of it. And then there was another point that I wanted to make, and I've lost my train of thought.
It was around the incentive to, like, why would you want to do that for a year? And you said it was compulsory.
It was compulsory. It'll come to me later. Oh, no, the other point was that we weren't supposed to tell people how extreme what we were doing was. So, for example, one sister got sent home to deal with a medical situation, and we called each other brother and sister. So she got home, and she was not only was she supposed to keep up a very, very strict schedule, restrict her sleep, not communicate with anybody on the internet, no phone calls, no TV, but she wasn't allowed to talk about what she was doing at church because it would, quote, scare the younger blessed children. So I don't know that any of us really understood what we were getting into. I'm sure that people talked, but I don't think anybody knew how extreme the situation was going to be. It was like considered top secret, because people hadn't spiritually prepared. Like you could tell your parents about it because our parents went through something like that. But even when I talked to my mom about it, she was on what was called mobile fundraising team, which was sort of the precursor to STF in the 70s and 80s. And she did that for several years. She was shocked that we were living in the vans because they had lived in centers when they were on MFT. So they'd go out in the van to do runs all day, but then they'd come home and sleep in like the barracks of the center because they had all these bunk beds in these rooms. And so even for my mother, who considered herself to be a fundamentalist Mooney, so like super hardcore, she thought that those were extreme conditions, but it still didn't deter her from having me go or anything like that.
Yep. And I wonder if when you mentioned having to go and sell those light belts with your mum,
mm-hmm.
whether she would have been under the same pressure as you in the STF, but you wouldn't have maybe realized at that point because you're younger, that there's the potential for her to be shamed if she doesn't make enough money with the types of things that she's trying to sell.
I think that my family always had money concerns, being a large family. And, anytime people worked for the church, you didn't make even what would have been considered a standard wage. So again, a lot of members lived under the poverty line. I don't know if there was any kind of reporting up in that. I think that she and the state leader of Arizona at the time looked at this as like spiritual training for us. That I don't think that STF had been conceived of at this time. I could be wrong. But I think that, the state leader had spent 10 years doing MFT. So the mobile fundraising team, he was even like a team captain. And so I think that he looked at it as like, this is how you train people, and he couldn't necessarily like make the distinction between these are children, not, members who are adults and of age. So I just think that that's how he thought that you like created good little Moonies, And I think that my mother respected him because he was her, quote, central figure, and he was more senior to her in the church, having spent more time. I think he joined earlier. He was a leader and he had been on MFT for so many years, that I think that she just sort of went along with what he said. Like, oh yeah, of course, this is how we make our children better. Like he even had us scrubbing his kitchen floor one day as an activity. We got toothbrushes and we were scrubbing the grout in the kitchen floor, and that was supposed to be like our fun activity, our get together for the week, and my mom was okay with this. In her mind, there was nothing wrong with an adult having 4 children under the age of 13 spending the afternoon scrubbing his kitchen floor. This was our spiritual training, and it was okay.
Every part of the spiritual training, every single aspect of it is just more and more and more thought reform. Every single piece of it, even down to scrubbing somebody's kitchen floor and you being told that this is a fun activity.
And when I tried to speak up about it, because I was like, I don't understand, why are we like not hanging out at the pool? Because we lived in a neighborhood where there was a community pool, and the other kids, the children of this leader, like shouted me down and were like, you're being so negative, you're always multiplying doubt, and then the father came in and he shamed me. He's like, well, do you know what true parents are doing? They're doing a 50-state speaking tour right now to save Christianity. Would you rather be doing that? And so it was like any time that there was any kind of dissension, that was a technique to beat people down, was to just use shame to silence them, and it made the indoctrination that much more effective.
Yeah, I don't know about what true parents were up to. They were probably trying to do damage control on one of their sons going off on a drug-fueled rage and whatnot. But you mentioned in your writing something about, I don't know how to pronounce this correctly, but the Ansu ritual?
Ansu, yeah. So I only did Ansu once towards the end of my time in the Unification Church, but I can give you sort of a perspective on it. So when I was 11 or 12, this new providence was established. And so providence is like, initiative, but it has a spiritual meaning. And basically, I think it was a new money-making initiative by the Unification Church. Moon had come across this woman who claimed to be channeling the spirit of his wife's dead mother. So we called her Daimonim. I don't know what her real name was, but she was a spiritual medium. And for somebody who supposedly had direct access to spirit world and God, Moon used a lot of mediums and like fortune tellers and stuff. And this particular medium supposedly could see your ancestors and see how they were attacking you. And this sort of new belief system that was established was that evil spirits and your own ancestors could attach to your body, and they were the cause of all sickness, all mental illness, everything. So if you got cancer, it was either because you had set a condition for evil spirit world to invade, or your ancestors were attacking you. And the only way to get rid of them was to go to this place called Cheongpyeong in Korea, which is it's in this lake district in Korea, and it's a piece of property that the Unification Church owned, or still owns actually. And you had to do this ritual called Ansu, which is a repeated slapping motion on your body. So there will be somebody who's leading the ritual, and they'll call out various body parts. And there are other people that are beating these traditional drums to a beat, and you are hitting yourself where they tell you to hit. So someone will call out head, and you take both of your hands and you start tapping your head. And then you'll do that for however long. And then someone will call out another body part, and then you start hitting another part of your body, all while singing this holy song called Grace of the Holy Garden over and over and over again in Korean. And Daimonim would go around the room. So it's now it's done at this palace in this big hall. But I think in the days when I was like 12, it was literally like people in tents. But she would go around the lines of people, and she could see the spirits that you weren't getting out. So she would hit you. And sometimes your neighbors would hit you. And people would come out of these like black and blue. And you would do it for like an hour and a half at a time, multiple times a day. So if that's not a brainwashing technique, I don't know what else is. But you had to pay to do this. Not only did you have to pay to get to Korea and to Cheongpyeong and pay for the workshop fees, but then there was also something called the Ancestor Liberation Fee. And you had to liberate, I think, 240 generations back on the mother's side, the father's side, and then like 2 grandparents' sides too, to cover all your bases. And so you had to pay X amount per generation, or per like block of generations. If you were Korean, it was cheaper. If you were American, it was middle of the road. And if you were Japanese, it was much more expensive. And so I remember being, again, 11 or 12 and asking my mom how this was different from indulgences, because before she had met the church, she had converted to Catholicism. And one of the things that she could not agree with in Catholicism was indulgences. And so I remember her telling me about that prior to this Cheongpyeong providence. And so one night when we're having tea, I'm like, Mom, how is this any different than that? She's like, no, it's completely different. So yeah, that's Ansu. And you couldn't just like sit at home and do Ansu. It had to be in a supervised setting, generally in Korea. The one time that I did it was at the Unification Theological Seminary in Barrytown, New York, when one of Moon's children led an Ansu session. And that was like, this is it. I'm done. I'm never doing this again. This is weird.
And the thing you mentioned about the ancestors as well, I interviewed a lady a while back, and she mentioned that you basically pay a ton of money to save the souls of ancestors that died like hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. So I think somebody did the math one time, and basically, like, if you go to X number of generations back, like, we're all related. So the amount of overlap that has been paid to liberate these ancestors is incredible. But I looked it up about 6 months ago, and I think at that time it was about $12,400 to liberate all of the ancestors. Now, you also have to bless your ancestors too, and that's a completely different fee as far as I understand.
Okay.
So yeah, as an American, you can expect to pay, I don't think it's even $12,400 per family. It might be per individual because everybody's lineage is slightly different. So it's quite pricey to be a Unification Church member.
Sounds when you were talking about sort of having those things attached to you and only being able to get rid of them in a certain way, that sounds like engrams within Scientology as well.
Yeah.
So obviously the process to get rid of them is a bit different than tapping yourself repeatedly on the head or the armpit or wherever you're being told to hit yourself for 3 hours at a time. But your timeline now seems to sound a bit like labor trafficking, and then leadership training at 14, and then you have the STF at 17. Then you've had this Ansu ritual that you've experienced, and then somehow you end up in this situation where you're placed in an arranged marriage. So just talk us through sort of the start of how did that subject get approached into sort of ending up in this situation?
Well, we would have to rewind a little bit to get there. When I was 15, my mother decided, and decided might be a very strong word, but she broke it to me that she thought that my father had been sexually abusing all of us children ever since we were little. None of us have any memory of it. And I've spoken to mental health professionals who think that, my mother might have been on the borderline personality disorder spectrum. And this seems like a very kind of BPD thing to accuse somebody of this. So, my father was a very abusive man, so I can't absolve him of everything. But the sexual abuse allegations is not something that I can lay at his feet because, again, none of us had any memory of it. But my mother decided that she was going to run away with us kids. Okay. Now, she had been grooming us to believe this for a very long time. I remember the first time that she had dropped hints about it. I was very young, right? And my brothers were like in diapers because she had said to me, "Have you ever touched your brothers inappropriately?" And I was like, I change their diapers every day. I might have accidentally touched them. Like, it gets messy down there. And, so I was anywhere between like 6 and 10, given how old my brothers were at that time. And so this was something that, she had been sort of socially grooming us to believe this for a long time, but she had never said outright. So when I was 15, she reveals these allegations and she runs away with us. But that has to be kept a secret because in her mind, if we had been sexually abused by our father, it would have been us falling. And she believed that could never have been, God couldn't forgive it. So we could have potentially lost our status as blessed children and nobody could find out. So she lied and said, my mission, her as my mother is taking me here and your father's mission is going to take us there. And that was sort of the facade that we kept up. But what this did was it put me into this sort of conundrum of no one's going to want me if they find this out. There were any number of family secrets in the church that could get you kind of ousted. And certainly this would have been one of them. And so now I have this additional sort of layer of secret identity that I have to protect, not just a blessed child, but potentially a fallen blessed child who has no memory of what may or may not have happened. And it was imperative to my mother that not only do we not reveal this because, she didn't want us to be exiled from the church, but she didn't want to ruin my matching opportunities. And during a church activity, it was called Pure Love Alliance, when I was 14, where we were like marching and trying to promote abstinence before marriage, which was a front for the Unification Church to get federal funding to teach abstinence-only education in the church, or in public schools, rather. I met somebody that I started to have feelings for, who was also in the church.
Okay.
And over time, we became very close emotionally, and he was the only person that I told about these allegations of my mother's. And he was like, oh, wow, the same thing happened to me. It wasn't my father, but I understand what you're going through. And so we bonded very much over this shared secret. And I kind of became convinced that, like, this is the only person that's going to be able to understand me. And when I was 16, Moon decided that he was going to stop matching the second generation. So it became very important to me to somehow kind of control my own destiny around this matching and blessing. I wasn't allowed to ask for it outright, but I started to try to like drop hints and introduce my mother to his mother and stuff like that, to the point where when I was 17, I sat my mother down and I said, listen, I want you to consider this person to be my match, because given our history, no one will accept me. And she still refused. And so around the time I was 18, this guy had been so emotionally abused by my mother, unfortunately, that he just abandoned me and got a girlfriend outside of the church, got her pregnant, like the whole, he was out of the picture.
He fell. He really fell.
He fell. Yeah. I didn't find out about it until he was actually taking the girl in for an abortion too. So I was sort of under the impression that we were having a fight, but that we would fix things. So it was pretty devastating for me. And so I think, from that point on, I became pretty malleable, because I'd been defying my mother for so long and trying to get this approved. It was sort of like her way of being like, see, look what it brings, when you stray. And so around the time that I was like 19, they did try to match me to somebody, and it was not a good fit. It did not. I basically, after I think 6 months, I was like, Mom, I cannot marry this guy. He's horrible. Like, it's just the worst. And I remember my mother being like, well, you can break the matching. And it had never been anything official or anything like that. It was like this suggestion, and we were getting to know each other. So it was, to me, it was like, okay, this is one more thing against me. Like, I didn't think this was a matching, because usually there'd be like an announcement to the community and photos sent out and like memos and stuff. And we had never gone through any of that. But to me, it was like one more layer of like, I am this untouchable. Nobody's going to want me now, because not only is there this deep secret, there was this emotional relationship with somebody that was illicit. Now there's potentially this broken matching. And so I was sort of fighting with this idea of leaving the church at 19. And I don't think that my mother knew necessarily, but she sensed enough. And I was also very bad at hiding my emotions from her. And in the church, you were supposed to like report your thoughts and your feelings to the central figure. So she was my mom. So I probably told her enough, that I shouldn't have, that she sent me again to this round of indoctrination activities. And I remember one of them was before and after every lecture. And again, these were lectures that I'd been hearing ever since I was very little, and they'd be very, very long. But before and after, the leader would play a slideshow of photos of Reverend Moon over and over and over again to this song. God, what was it? The Reason? Is it by Hoobastank?
Yep.
I hate that song. So they'd play that song on loop in a dark room with these pictures of Reverend Moon over and over again. And so I remember like we were supposed to put our hands up in the air, and we'd supposed to be like praying in our hearts or whatever. And by like the third day of that, I would just like tears pouring down my face, like something in me just totally broke.
Yeah, especially the lyrics are like, I'm sorry that I hurt you. And it's like, what is the message there? Are you supposed to be like repenting for something?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we were taught that anytime that we did anything that was like not on the straight and narrow, we were breaking God's already broken heart. God in the Unification Church is this very suffering God and a very impotent God too. He couldn't do anything. But he was always brokenhearted. And also everything that we did that was bad hurt true parents. And there was a very blurred line, I think, between like God and Moon. Like Moon started to sort of deify himself in the end. But I don't think he was explicit about it at that point. But yeah, it was definitely like we were supposed to be repenting in our heart for everything that we had done to hurt God and true parents. And so I was like totally broken. And after that, I was sent to work for the second generation department in New York City. And it was, I thought I was going to get a room in the 43rd Street building that the church owned because they have like dormitory style accommodations there. I arrived, I find out I'm going to be paid $100 a month, and I'm sleeping on the floor of a room with a bunch of missionaries, right? And they would like get up at like 2:30 in the morning to go out for their mission and fundraise. So completely broken sleep. I'd have to be in the office by 6 o'clock in the morning for our morning services, Hundake. I'd work until like 8 o'clock at night. And I was living off of rice and kimchi every day because unless I took my money to buy like a 99-cent slice of pizza, I wasn't eating otherwise. And so I was working for the church for like 3 months, sometimes literally sleeping in the office under my desk because I couldn't sleep in the missionary room because they'd play Celine Dion all night to drown out the sirens that you would hear in New York City. And they'd wake up at 2:30 in the morning, turn the lights on, get dressed. So yeah, I started sneaking into the office to sleep. So you can imagine the level of indoctrination at that point.
Yep.
Sleep deprived, food deprived, and just constantly being subjected to conditions that would just addle your brain. I went home right before Christmas because we celebrate Christmas in the Unification Church, but also New Year's Day is God's Day, which is like the highest holy day. So I was going to go visit my family. I used the last of my stipend to buy the train ticket home, and I arrive. And I guess by like between leaving New York City and arriving upstate in New York, there had been this announcement that Moon was going to do a matching for the first time in like 4 years.
Right.
So I arrive home and my parents sit me down and they're basically like, you have to go to this because like you are the example in our family, right? And if you have trouble getting matched, it's going to be a problem for your siblings. Moon was in his 80s at that point, and my mom was like, who knows how many more matchings father will do. And I kept being like, I don't know, I'm not ready, I'm not comfortable with this. And she goes, Jenny, if Jesus came to you and said he had found your perfect spouse, what would you say to him?
Now, but how can she say that to you after she's told you that your father sexually abused you your whole life, like growing up?
Right,
and
right.
So she's not married to the perfect man, is she? She's
right,
not.
Right. Well, and like, she'd also gotten back together with him at that point too, and we weren't allowed to talk about what had happened anymore. It was sort of this thing that she wanted us to sweep under the rug, and so even when she said that, I was still like, I don't know. And she goes, how much more than Jesus is Father, to kind of like drive the point home. And it was really interesting because I had been brought up to believe that, the person that was picked for you as your blessing partner was the perfect person for you. But that didn't necessarily mean that you would be happy with this person. It meant that like this person would bring out whatever you had to work on to become perfect. So anyway, at that point, I was so indoctrinated that I was like, okay, fine, I guess so. And I was under the impression that it was just a matching ceremony, that I might have like, years to get to know this person before going through with a blessing. But when she dropped me off at the East Garden Mansion compound, I get to this ballroom and not only do girls have their wedding dresses there, but then somebody tells me, yeah, no, there's going to be a blessing in 3 days.
Oh my goodness.
You're not leaving. You're not allowed to leave. And I was freaking out. I was borrowing people's cell phones because I didn't have a cell phone in those days, calling my parents, begging for them to come pick me up. I was like, I can't be here. I can't do this. And I worked my way up the leadership chain of command to the point where I got to the highest person there. And I went into this office with him and I was like, here is why I cannot do this. And I gave him like my full confession. This is what my mom accused my dad of. How could I like be in a relationship with somebody when I'm dealing with the trauma of this? I don't know if it's true or not. And I'm like finished sobbing, snot pouring down my nose. And he looks at me and he goes, you know what I think? I think you're chicken shit.
Oh,
and I was just like, yeah. And I was like, you're right. I am chicken shit, you know, because again, totally indoctrinated. And so 3 days later, I was I was married to a complete stranger. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. What was his name? What did he look like?
I don't want to share his name, but he was very, very tall and gangly from Norway, very, very white, did not speak very good English, like very kind of younger than me too, still in high school. So I think he was like 10 years younger than me. Yeah. So very immature. Like he was a kind person. He was a nice person, but also, again, very indoctrinated into Unification Church teaching. So like when I didn't tell him something, like if he found out that I had a doctor's appointment and he didn't know about it, you know, and he was in Norway and I was in the United States, he'd call me up very angry that I didn't tell him. And he'd be like, I am your husband. I am the subject, you know, because in Unification Church theology, the man is the subject and the woman is the object. And so I was supposed to submit to him. So yeah, it was not a good relationship, but I don't think that he was a bad person. I think he was just very, very young. And it was funny because I remember talking to him early on and being like, I don't believe in this. Like, why would we do this? And he's like, I don't know if I believe in it either, but I think we can make it work, you know? And so that's the level to which he had been indoctrinated.
Yep. And I mean, just to go back on a few things you said, which were just breaking my heart when I was just listening to you talk about it. You know, you're given this news at 15. Well, outright, you're given the news at 15 about your father, and then you have these years of being so confused and finding like a confidant, somebody that you can share this information with, and somebody that you feel like you finally have this connection with, who also happens to be inside the church. So all things seem to be looking up in terms of how you know, your doubts are kind of still there, but they can take a back seat because you found the potential way of being sort of happy or managing to stay within the church because of this person that you found. And I just can't, it's so upsetting because every time something happened, it's almost like your mum was gaslighting you with what she would say in the terms of, we had to leave your father, we have to run away from your father because you will lose the status of being a blessed child. And to me, obviously not being indoctrinated and being on the outside, and I'm thinking to myself, it's much more important to get your child the help that they might need than it would be for them to lose their status as a blessed child.
Yeah, I mean, there was nowhere to go for help either because I remember one time my mom telling me, again, I was very young in elementary school, that she had started to see a counselor. And she said, you know, he started shouting penis at me. And so I never went back. And this was like for her to tell me that like people in these helping professions were not to be trusted. I cannot imagine. She painted this person as like crazy, like he was crazy. He just started shouting penis. Like as an adult, I look back and I'm like, was she sitting there with a therapist who said, you know, how do you react to the word penis?
Yes.
Like that to me is probably what had happened, and she got triggered. My sister and I think that she might have been a victim.
Yes, I did think that when you mentioned that she accused your father, but you weren't sure and had no recollection of whether maybe she was kind of almost trying to recover from her own experiences growing up as a child who may have been abused.
Right. I think she must have had this conversation with my sister about like a neighbor when she was young. She was born in Mexico. And so it may have been when she was like 5 and still living in Mexico. It was like an upstairs neighbor or something. Or maybe it was when her family came to the United States when she was 7. I did not have that conversation with my sister, or with my mother rather. But when my sister shared this information with me, as adults, she and I were able to process together. It was probably this happened to our mom and she was projecting onto our father. I think too, like, to be married to somebody that you don't know, that you don't love, and to have to go through the sexual ritual and then have children with them, there must be a lot of sexual trauma in that anyway. And so if there's somebody that's carrying any kind of latent trauma like that, as a victim in childhood or even, later adulthood, I can imagine that would just compound the trauma. And so I'm in no way excusing my mother, but at the same time, I have a lot of compassion for somebody who didn't get the help that she needed and didn't know how to get the help that she needed, because, she had been indoctrinated to believe that the outside world was evil. She had taught us to believe that, any kind of government services were evil. Foster care was always threatened. Like, if you tell anybody what's happening, because again, our father was very physically abusive, CPS will come and take you away and you'll get split up and put into foster care. That was like the threat that we got all the time. So there was nowhere to go outside of the church. In the church, she did try to seek out counseling. And that's what ended up getting my parents back together, is the church forced them back together. And I remember sitting down with a counselor when I was 17, and I was very angry about the fact that my parents were being forced back together. And I was like, look, this doesn't solve anything. Like, sexual abuse aside, I have no recollection of this. I don't know what it is, but it was still an abusive situation. And the woman who was the counselor, she was very high up in leadership. She goes, honey, I think all of that's in your head. So again, just there was a lot of gaslighting that occurred. I'm pretty sure there was another person that we went to counseling with, but at this point, like, I've blocked it out, but she was the headmistress of a boarding school in the church that my sister and I went to. And I think it was a similar situation. And that's not the first or only time that somebody in the church told you that, like, the pain was in your head, or your struggles were in your head. You were just supposed to, like, cut off that part of your emotional experience and focus on the mission. So I remember being on Pure Love Alliance, and I was struggling at that point. I was 15. My parents had split. I'm trying to hide this, and I was so upset because, like, I didn't even know where I was coming home to. My mom had run away with the kids and sent me off for a month. And a leader, I wouldn't share with her what was going on necessarily, but she said, whatever you're struggling with, the pain is all in your head and you need to focus on the mission. So it's not that it was like one problematic person. It's that there was that problematic culture.
Absolutely. Yep. And, you've mentioned that the parents and the first generation members of the Unification Church would have experienced their own levels of indoctrination that might cause your mum to say things like, we can't risk losing your status as blessed children. Not to mention what she may have been struggling with in terms of mental health as well. But the sad thing that I think comes from those statements that your mum says to you, like, oh, so you're going to break the matching, and you've had this illicit relationship with this other person in the church, even though we haven't matched you. It leads you to say these things, which you said at least 4 or 5 times this episode, that no one will want me.
Yeah,
that's what those statements reinforce. Which is obviously not true, because you're married now. It's not to a big, tall Norwegian guy, but to somebody that you obviously love and trust and have a safe relationship with.
Yeah.
But the difficulty in these statements that your mum says to you, probably because of her own indoctrination, leads you to say things from the age of 15 to your early 20s. No one will want me. And that is such an awful and heartbreaking statement to say to yourself. And it's not something anybody should ever have to experience or feel.
Yeah. And I also think that it was again, you'd have to survey enough people to really get statistical evidence around this, but I don't think that was an uncommon experience. I think that it might have been put in different ways, But I think that that's something that a lot of us experienced, either from our parents or from church leadership. It might have been different circumstances, but anything that you did to stray or to lead you closer to falling, it was a stain on your purity. And the Unification Church definitely adopted purity culture from the white evangelical Christian movement. And so that's a lot of indoctrinations that's happening in evangelical Christianity too. And we amplified it with our theology and with our behaviors.
Yeah. And I think it's similar to the tactics that are used where people will say, well, everybody outside of this movement is evil. And they will be your undoing. I guess it's the same as making you feel like, well, no one will want me, so I have to stay here because I don't have any other choice. It's the same as, well, I don't want to go and interact with anybody outside of the church because I don't know what type of sin they'll bring down on me. And so I guess it's the same kind of technique and tactic. But how did you break away from the church in the end? What does that journey look like from kind of being in this marriage, managing to kind of get the marriage broken, and then taking the step to leave the church officially?
So it's interesting because there's no paperwork that you sign. I did have to sign paperwork to break the blessing, so to officially end the marriage, even though it was never a legal marriage as far as, the United States and Norway were concerned. We were taught to believe that church doctrine was above secular law. And so in my mind, even though I wasn't even really a believer in the church anymore, it was really important to get that document signed, because otherwise I knew that the husband, his family, my parents would never consider it over and would always harass me about it. Basically for me, after I signed that document, that was kind of the end for me. I was already being shunned by a lot of people because they knew that I was struggling. I was very open about my struggles. Obviously, everybody saw me falling apart too in the ballroom of East Garden, like sobbing, begging to leave. So I was by no means a model member at that point. I did work for the church during the time of my marriage, and I remember talking to other people too. I think because I would go through these waves of well, maybe I need to make it work. I've read old journals and they're heartbreaking to see the language that I use, because I can see the core inner self coming out in some entries where I'm like, oh, I recognize that person. That is the healthy part of my brain. And then the next day it would be church lingo, and I shudder when I think about them. But I can see kind of that up and down as I was sort of oscillating between I need to fight for myself and I need to be a better person in the church and make this marriage work. But the breaking point came for me through a sort of series of events. My mother contracted Lyme disease, I think for the third time, unfortunately. She had gotten Lyme disease even before I was born, when she was doing something called pioneering. So witnessing with no established church in West Virginia. She got Bell's palsy and the entire left side of her face was paralyzed for a while. I don't think that the church got her medical treatment for it either, because she, up until, she passed away 6 years ago, the left side of her face still had nerve damage.
Right.
And growing up, she thought that when I was growing up, she thought she had MS because it had been undiagnosed Lyme. And when she had Bell's palsy, the second in command in the church, Dr. Pock, told her that it was spirit world attacking her because she was struggling with my match with my father. So, this is just another example of medical neglect and indoctrination. But she was diagnosed with Lyme disease, I think when I was 21. And she didn't respond to antibiotics, so she had to have intravenous treatment. And I left work at that point to come live with my parents, because I was living in New York City, to be her caretaker. And I was giving her injections every day. I don't know why my father wasn't doing it. I guess their relationship was just so broken at that point that, she would have preferred me as her caretaker. But this husband at the time wanted to come visit. And I was like, this is not a good time for me. My mother is ill. And I am the primary caretaker, not only of her, but of my siblings at this point, because my father was just, checked out. And he was very offended by this. And then I want to say, so that I think was in February of 2005. Maybe it was 2006. I'm a little unclear on my timeline. But then that summer, I think that was February 2006. And then in the summertime, my mother had recovered enough that she decided to leave for the summer to go work at a camp. She just abandoned the kids. Mm-hmm. And my father was going to be off in Korea at a conference.
Right.
And so it was basically like, Jen, you're going to have to take care of the kids for the summer. You're going to have to leave your job. And by the way, we're also moving house. And I was like, wait, what? Excuse me? So my sister and I had to pack up the entire house and move my parents and my siblings from one town to another. And this is another time where the husband emails and is like, I really want to come visit. We need to work on our relationship. And I'm like, dude, this is not a good time. Like, I cannot handle moving house, taking care of my siblings, dealing with all this. So come September, my mother has come home from her camp job where she was away for like 3 months. And she tells my sister that she's found a lump in her breast.
Right.
And so she gets the biopsy and it's cancer.
Right.
And so now I am caretaking for my mother as she goes through multiple surgeries and then chemo and then radiation. And the husband emails again and says, I want to come visit. You cannot say no to me this time. And I'm like, she's got cancer. I can't. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. He bought a ticket and showed up in the United States. And so the day before my 22nd birthday, I drove him to the Unification Theological Seminary. I demanded an audience with the head of the second generation department for Europe, who happened to be in town for a workshop. And I was like, here's the deal. This is what's happening. Get me the paperwork. I'm done. I mean, I was in tears, it was
you've got
horrible.
So much to deal with at this point. You've got so much to deal with.
Right. And so that for me was the end. Even though like he continued to call me and be like, are we over? Are we working on this? I'm like, we signed paperwork. We're done. But I think so through the winter then of 2007, I was still caretaking for my mother. My uncle from Mexico did come up and help out as well. And so what that did for me was it allowed me to unfortunately, through her illness, like my mother was less of a pervasive force in my life, and my uncle wasn't in the church. And so his presence in the house kind of created this sort of interesting buffer for our churchiness. We were never very close. We were always taught that our relatives outside the church were of Satan. So I didn't know him that well, couldn't confide in him. But I started taking classes at the local community college. And then once I had gotten in enough courses, I decided I was going to transfer to the state university nearby. And by the time my mom was done with treatment, I moved out to go to college.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think had she not been sick, it would have been a much longer process for me. Mm-hmm. And, certainly there was a lot of threats. There was a lot of physical abuse from both my parents around it. But unfortunately, through her illness, it did give me that mental and emotional space to not be so abused and dominated by her. I mean, like, I made the choice, even like I had tried to break this marriage multiple times prior to her illnesses, and the guy he never accepted it. So it was really only when he showed up that I was able to get him in a room and sign the paperwork. So whether or not she had been ill, I would have still made the same choices that I made.
Yeah.
But I was able to drift from the church because my mother wasn't trying to control everything in my life at that point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you just had, and it's such a familiar story that I know all of the listeners will be like, yes, we've heard this. We have heard this. You just needed that small break, that small amount of time to think for yourself, to get a good night's sleep, get a good meal, have the responsibility lifted off of you when your uncle comes to visit. which is funny because, you know, he's of Satan, but when it comes to him coming into the house to help, then obviously that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's really heartbreaking the amount of support that financially that both of my parents gave to keep a roof over my family's head over the years, and then the support that my uncle gave to my mother. Like, to me, it's like none of them were religious, but if you think about like what Christianity talks about in terms of caring for people, like they were so of that mindset of like caring for their family. It's such a dichotomy to, you know, the way that the church functioned in terms of like what family was. And I didn't get a lot of contact with my relatives because of the way that the church functioned, but to me, they were a better model for the ideal family in that sense. And obviously, like, we all have problems, but my uncle, I think it might have been like 6 months or something like that. He left his wife in Mexico to come care for his sister for at least 3 months, maybe 6. I don't remember at this point because it was, 15 years ago. Yeah, I mean, who does that?
Well, that's
really a really good person.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it should be with family and friends. It's unconditional.
Yes.
His love and support doesn't come with, well, you need to stop telling me I'm a worldly person, or I'm of Satan, or I'm sinful, and then I'll come and help. It that's not the stance that he has.
Right.
Whereas if it would have been sort of the other way around, if it would have been maybe Unification Church members with their responsibilities and their commitment to the church and services and activities that happen sort of morning, noon and night, it might not have been the same if somebody said outside of the church, listen, I really need your help.
Oh, yeah.
Because then it might have been conditional, well, I can come and help you, but only, if X, Y, Z. So it's really wholesome that you've painted that picture of I recently spoke to an ex-Jehovah's Witness who said that he did some backpacking and traveling, and he went to meet with other congregations and other kingdom halls around the different parts of the world he visited, and he just found each congregation to be so unwelcoming or judgy or conditional. But then all the people outside of the church of whichever religion or walk of life they came from, that he met in the hostels he stayed in, and the airports that he traveled to, he just said that they were the most incredible people he'd ever met, and that is really what opened his eyes, because the friendships that he made with those people were unconditional. It didn't matter. They didn't need to be, in the church to be able to have a good relationship or a trusting relationship. So that was really nice. And you've kind of painted that same picture there with your uncle and him coming over to help.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things that I thought of as you were talking about that. One is that as somebody that didn't grow up in a tight church community, when I did try to integrate into church communities later, I did find that same thing, that they were very unwelcoming. Like when I was working for the second generation department, I would go to young adult services in Westchester, New York, and in northern New Jersey. And I remember after one of the services, a bunch of us went to IHOP, and this guy was sitting across from me, and he just looks at me and goes, so when are you going back to where you came from? Like, it was just such an unwelcoming thing. And I realized like, oh, I am other. Not only am I other because I'm carrying all of this baggage, but they don't want me here. Like, I'm not of their community. And it's something that I experienced even when I was little, and we would go to church on the holy days. There was like 8 of them on the church calendar. And so we would drive 2 hours to DC, and I started being too afraid to go to Sunday school because the kids were so unwelcoming. And then conversely, I loved theater. And so the theater community, especially as I was transitioning out of the church, was such an interesting counterpoint to me, because it is such a loving, welcoming kind of community. They became my surrogate family as I was transitioning out. That's where I met my partner, and to me, it did create such a beautiful possibility of what could be. You know, and that's not to say that, like, you know, the theater community is perfect or anything, but certainly coming from the environment that I came from, it was such a breath of fresh air that, you know, to this day, like, I have such a deep love for those people in that place, you know.
Amazing. So I guess the only thing that's left now is to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing online to advocate for other members leaving or who have left the church. And then just to ask you what advice you have for others who are looking to leave their high controlling environments.
Right. So the work that I do as an artist is I do explore the feminine experience, at least my experience as a woman in the Unification Church, through visual arts. So I do a lot of self-portraiture and photography to delve into those experiences, and I connect them to, you know, religious trauma and sexual trauma and just this sense of indoctrination as well. And so I spend a lot of time on social media kind of diving into that and trying to help make those connections for people that are interested. And for anybody that is looking to leave a high control environment, I would say search out the information on the internet. It was not something that I left in 2007. There was very little resource available to examine the Unification Church. The one place that I did gravitate to was a blog called How Well Do You Know Your Moon? And it is fabulous. And so for anybody looking to leave the Unification Church, I highly recommend that. But, you know, there are a number of resources available through the International Cultic Studies Association that can kind of teach you the basics of what does a high demand environment look like, what are the techniques used, and if you can start to check the boxes and say, like, oh, this applies to my experience, this applies to my experience, it can help you to begin to disconnect and understand what is being done to you and how to avoid it. Obviously, the best thing that you can do is to create that space for yourself to think, to breathe, to sleep, to eat, you know, give yourself access to all the resources that you were not allowed in the group. But the International Cultic Studies Association also has recovery workshops, and they have a list of cult-aware therapists. And I have to say that finding somebody in the therapy community who understands how high-demand groups work has been one of the greatest things for my recovery, because I don't have to spend time educating the therapist. They already know. You know, they may not speak Unification Church language, but they understand my dialect. You know, I've spoken to others from like Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups, and it's so funny. We do speak the root language. It's just, like I said, different dialects. And it'd be like, oh, you call it that, we call it this. You know? And so it's very funny to be in a recovery workshop with other second-generation adults of various groups, because you come to realize that our group wasn't special. We were all very
same, but different.
Exactly. And so, that I think would be the greatest advice that I can give is seek out educational resources. If you've been indoctrinated to not believe those resources, it's going to be hard in the beginning. But, you know, trying to really understand logistically, like, what the group did, what the justifications that the group made, and ask yourself, like, are these things that a good person would do? You know, like with Moon, there are many things that we justified in the Unification Church, but you really have to ask yourself, is this what a godly person would do? And I think that you can start the deconstruction process there. Is this what loving, ideal families would do to their children? Like on STF, a girl was murdered.
Oh my
goodness. And they kept sending us back out to fundraise.
Oh my goodness.
Right. So if the premise of the Unification Church is we are building ideal, blessed families, and blessed children are the most precious resource to God, why would you send your children out to fundraise in a dangerous area where somebody could get murdered? And why would you continue to run a program like that? You know, the Unification Church was running the offshoot of STF called Global Peace Academy, GPA, during COVID. They recently shut that down, but they were still exposing their children to something incredibly dangerous and, you know, potentially exposing other people that were being fundraised too. So you have to ask the question, is this what godly people do? And when you start there, I think that the theology starts to break down. And you can start your deconstruction process there.
Yeah, I think that sounds like great advice. We've talked a lot on this podcast before about the perks of therapy, and you know, a lot of people have given their testaments to how that's changed their lives for the better, you know, finding a suitable therapist. And even though that's not an option and is not accessible for everybody that might be listening, that might benefit from therapy of one type or another, the online resources are endless. And those are things, if you're listening to this podcast, those are things that you probably do have the means to access at some level. And Teddy mentioned the platform How Well Do You Know Your Moon as well. So there are plenty of places that people can go and look for support. Jen, thank you so much for coming and sharing your story. You've taken me on a wild journey this evening. We've gone through all sorts of different themes and topics, and we've spoken about all the different difficult things a young person might experience growing up through their life, from upheaval and transitional periods to the prospect of child abuse, physically or sexually. We've talked about all different types of levels of indoctrination from every single possible source possible. And yet here you are talking to me with a smile on your face. You've got your cats. You're in a loving relationship that you know seems to be stable, and you are an example of somebody that can go through all of these horrible processes and experiences, but get to a place of comfort and safety and self-realization and self-respect and love as well.
Yeah, and I want to give the message of hope, and I also want to acknowledge that it's a hard journey. I believe in human resiliency. I believe that we can all get here, and I want to acknowledge that it's hard, you know. And so for anybody that is trying to get out, like, you have my ultimate respect and love and emotional support in that regard, because I know that it's hard, and there are always going to be hard days, and hopefully, you know, each step away from the cult makes it easier.
And we're just here chatting away for anyone else that wants to join us. You know, I'm not going anywhere, so get in touch and come and chat about your experiences, and maybe, you know, if you're ready, that is, it will help. So thank you so much, Jen, for your time. I really, really appreciate it, and I just hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to chat with you.
Take care, Jen. Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.